Hello, everybody. Tom, Owen, Daniel. My name's Andrew. We're all together here to talk about, I think we're here to talk about, in a sense, we both have platforms. You guys have your Technosocial platform, and you're, a bit younger than we are. So there's a generational difference between us. At the same time, we're traveling in the same kind of intellectual, spiritual space in many ways, I think. And me and Tom began a website newscast called Parallax, and I've been working with him and blogging on that site. And we've had, big hopes and dreams for building this site into something that I think will reflect a kind of a, we could say a paradigm, the new paradigm, let's say, of media, the new paradigm of online, information, ideas, something that's removed from woke, that's removed from censorship, which is, open and interesting. And I think we're all trying to do that, I think, right? If everybody would agree with that. So I thought of framing this discussion as being a discussion about what is this new paradigm, right? What is this?
Yeah.
What is this? Let's say, kind of shifting, ambiguous space that we're in right now. And Tom is often speaking about postmodernism. What's after postmodernism? On our site, we often talk about the exodus from the big media platforms. It's a term that me and Alexander Bard use a lot. How to create the next exodus. We also have other terms that we throw around in our circles. One is called the Renaissance. So we've been talking about the exodus from the big social media platforms. We also been talking about the Renaissance in terms of rediscovering, let's say, more primordial notions and ideas and thoughts. And also in the last conversation, we thought it might be interesting to talk about alchemy, which I think, Daniel, you have an interest in that, and at least I do, and that might be also a subject of conversation. So does anybody want to riff on my introduction on where we're going here?
Yeah, let me pick up on that. So totally, it does feel like we're at the end of a time period, of an age, right? There's a lot of conversation talking about postmodernism, transmodernism, metamodernism. What do we call that which we are living in today? I think the way that I would connect that to perhaps alchemy and would be something like, one of the things that alchemy does, as far as I can tell, is it works with the prime matter that is human perception. And one of the things that I contend is that time is a feature of human perception, not of reality. So when we're talking about what comes after postmodernism, we're assuming linear time. But to me, the question is more like, who is capable of actually putting down the foundations for that which comes after postmodernism? Because one of the features of postmodernism, as I guess we all kind of understand, is that it's saturated. It's the end of everything. Nothing is new. Everything is in decay, late civilizational decay, right? A little bit like the Dark Ages or late Rome. And I feel like the ability to put down the foundations for something new is kind of what we are all doing. To name it precociously is perhaps less interesting than talking about how it can come to be. And that's, I guess, our interest in alchemy, especially in the age of digital technology.
Okay. Owen, do you have anything to say about that? You want to?
I think, I might zoom back to one of the things you said when you just started off about this, what this new paradigm kind of looks like. And I think the way I always conceive about this, it's it's the media first. It's this new information communication technology that has really changed things. The essay to read to start thinking about this way is Jordan Hall's essays, which are pretty much like classic by now in whatever bubble this is that we're existing within, on the collapse of the blue church, right? The idea that human societies have always had to solve the question of how to generate coherence. An example he gives is like, if you've got people rowing a boat, if you've got one person or people rowing a boat, you can kind of just keep each other in time. But when you've got 50 people in a boat, how do you get them all to row at the same time? Well, you get someone else to beat the drum or to call the song or whatever it is that then allows the other 50 to stay in time with. Now, what he contends is the blue church structure is the way that that was done in the mass modern societies was with big broadcast monodirectional media structures. So broadcasting, they go out like in met like from to all directions, but then also monodirectional. There's a speaker or a very few speakers who then transmit their message to a large population. And essentially that was the way that the 20th century was able to, the 20th century nations were able to manage themselves, whether the communist ones or the capitalist ones. There was a media infrastructure that allowed for a shared sense of reality. In the UK, we had the right-wing press and the left-wing press and a few TV channels, but there was basically a shared reality tunnel that everyone existed within with a few bit of contentions. What happens with the internet, with YouTube, with podcasting is that shared reality is utterly gone. I was talking to someone about it once, and he was talking about how when he was a guy in his 40s or 50s, in the UK, we have a TV show called Top of the Pops. So we used to have, and it was like the pop musicians of the day would come on and do a video. And he said everyone would watch that because it was the cool thing that was on. Now, what's happened today? There is no Top of the Pops. There is no one thing that everybody watch. In fact, there's millions of things that everybody watches. And in some way, that's great because it's like ultimate personalized consumer media entertainment. But in the other sense, there is no longer a shared cultural mythos that everybody belongs to. And what I would suggest is that in these supposedly secular 19th, 20th century societies, when they're supposedly atheist, but really the media culture served as the new mythos, the new religion. And that church, hence Jordan Hall's terming it a blue church, right? That church has fragmented. And where we are now is that we're beginning to experiment with the new multi-directional media where everybody has a voice. I mean, the most obvious examples of this are Twitter and Facebook, but the problem is, I mean, Alexander's great at laying this out. Everybody's screaming. That's Alexander Bard, by the way, the philosopher.
Yeah, he calls those sites child diseases or something, or children's diseases, or, you know, because it's a narcissism kind of run amok, or, you know.
Right. Everybody's screaming and competing for likes and attention, but there's actually not much meaningful content being produced there, or if it is, it just gets drowned in the sludge. But with things like Zoom and with podcasting and with YouTube and with mailing lists and other formats that we don't even know of yet, there's a possibility for doing something more, which is, I think, trying to establish real, meaningful intellectual spaces to begin to ponder, like, okay, fuck, what the fuck is going on and where do we go now?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Tom, why don't you talk about Parallax, or you know, the vision, the intellectual vision of Parallax in relation to what these guys have been saying, perhaps. Is that possible?
Well, I had some technical difficulties, so I didn't get the first part of what you guys were saying, but the general idea, you know, what I see, I just saw yesterday this phenomenal podcast between Joe Rogan and Douglas Murray, you know, and you know, the problems of the left and the reaction it provokes in a kind of way. And then you have, you know, this complete disconnect between media and the reality and what's happening within the United States and between Europe and the United States. And, you know, to answer your question, you know, to have some sane perspectives on what's going on in the world and some sense making, that is something that drives me. And I would like to do this with Parallax, you know, just because it's just, you know, to try to create a more meaningful picture of what's going on in the world, you know, not this left-wing mainstream focus on just a tiny part of the world, you know. And so I don't know, it's just a mess out there, you know, and so some sane and rational and yeah, in this respect, progressive views on where we can go individually and socially. So I don't know if that.
Well, it's interesting you're using that term in a positive light, because that term has such negative connotations. You know, these days it's sort of being progressive has become a kind of if you're progressive, you're kind of reactionary or something these days. It's kind of weird.
Right.
There's this inversion of everything. Yeah.
Right.
If you're super left wing, you're reactionary conservative, and if you're conservative now, you're somehow radical. You know, on some level, you're like the cutting edge, like Douglas Murray or something. He's a conservative, right?
Right.
He's the cutting edge. What? So it's a weird sort of inversion.
Right.
I like that you guys mentioned progress, and I want to bring it back to the word church used by Owen and Jordan Hall previously, because to me this is really a theological question. So in the same way that perhaps at the start of the 20th century God died, as per Nietzsche, there was a theological transition of ways of being in the world. And one of the things that I contend is that it is the prerogative and the mission of theological constructs to generate reality, to generate ways of seeing the world. The previous one, the Blue Church, said that progress and the belief in the future is the way to go, that future is really about maximizing pleasure, reducing pain, and it put down certain guidelines that were sort of the dogmas of the age, right? Dugin criticizes this, obviously, from his point of view, but the critique is nonetheless notable when he says that the dogmas of the time of the 20th century of the Blue Church include something like human rights, like the dogmatic category of the individual, which is so ontologically generative that we cannot even conceive of it because we are to it like fish are to water. We don't, you know, in other times and other places, people might consider the world to be based around family or the parish or the clan. But today, you know,
or responsibilities rather than rights, to, you know,
exactly,
or your how you contribute to the society, right? Not as an individual, but how you contribute to this, to how you are of service to the society, rather than just trying to get your rocks off or something.
Exactly. And this is not even, I would sort of expand on that and say that it's not even only framing the relationship of the individual to the society. It's framing the way that the individual creates itself as a subject. In other words, to say individual as a word is already a way to subject, to subjectify, to frame that being in a relationship of power, to frame that being in a view of time. That's also the Heideggerian way of really going to the depth of really how are we even talking about these things? Let's question them more deeply. And there's a lot of unasked questions behind the emergence of something like the Blue Church and its consequences leading up to today, and sort of the cultural warfare situation that we include ourselves in. And so that's why Owen and I always come back again to this idea of alchemy, this idea of ontological designing as a potential solution, because it's the recognition that the theological dogmas that frame how we even consider ourselves subjects are something that is in crisis, and we need to step up. And obviously that's what we're trying to do with platforms and conversations like this, to really try to not only figure out what might be a way that we could share, but even the way we talk about that is generative ontologically.
I want to know a little bit about what you mean by alchemy, because alchemy is normally considered sort of a prototype of science and full of all kinds of superstition and that. But I think the appeal of alchemy is that it doesn't, you can play more. It's not so reductive as mechanical science can be. In other words, it doesn't, it's the imaginative aspect is the subjective imaginative aspect is included, in the experiment, right? With the object. So
the way that we use the term alchemy is in a way kind of interchangeable with ontological design, which is the idea that we are performing changes in perception and the subjectivity of the being itself. And by framing perhaps the individual within a set of relationships with objects, ideas, worldviews, technologies. By curating this relationship, we're actually designing the individual. We're not designing magazines, we're not designing chairs, we're not designing architecture, we're designing people. And that's a really fucking big mind shift. That,
well, because the medium is the message. I'm sorry to interrupt again. In other words, the platforms that we're creating here, like Parallax and all that, and Technosocial, that is an alchemical human creation of some sort, which you interface with and changes you on some level.
Precisely,
right?
Because the mimetic apparatuses that we instantiate and create through these platforms are the very means by which people process energy, by which they sort of equilibrate or balance their sex economy, if you want to quote Wilhelm Reich. It's the way that they are subjects, right? But this just boils down to the simple Heideggerian idea that subject and object are the same, that there's not actually any difference, which is not only Heideggerian, but also post-human in a way, which is, my clothes and myself, what's the difference, right? They're an extension of my skin. The glasses are an extension of our eyesight. And so there's a deep, intimate relationship between ourselves and technology. And, 2020, we might as well look into that because that has generative properties for reality.
Which is, of course, fascinating because it brings us into a way of seeing that is quite ancient in the world and has been kind of dismissed by much of the progressive rational paradigm, which is, there's many names for it, like animism would be one of them, like just spirituality would be another. I think in contemporary philosophy, there's a movement called Agential Realism, which is like moved by people like Karen Barrett and a couple of others. Essentially, the idea being that there is something animate in all matter and indeed in all supposedly objective properties, some unfolding thing, which again is like the Heideggerian language, right? And I find this super intriguing to begin to actually to ask what it was that enabled people to experience the world in such a way, and how then they tamed that experience of perception. And we are back there, whether or not we admit it or not. Just having a phone in your pocket means that the world is speaking at you constantly, and unless you've got the absolute fucking resistance to your notifications or got them turned off, then you just get drawn into it. And I've been spending myself listening to podcasts a lot of the time at the moment. So I walk around and in some sense, plastic is speaking to me at every moment. I'm hearing human voices in every direction. And I mean, that was the case when we had radio and television, but I don't think it's ever been quite so pronounced, at least in recent times, that the world is literally speaking to us and throwing communication to us in all directions, in all different formats, at all different times. There's this animistic way of being. And alchemy begins to then be, in the context that we're thinking about it, like the discipline of starting to go, okay, the world is alive again. What the fuck do we do about it?
Precisely. Let me read you something very quickly that I took from Nick Land's, from one of his websites. How does the press warn the public about demons arising from a master algorithm without making it sound like a magical spell? With great difficulty, because the actual bedrock of reality may not only be stranger than the narrative supposes, but stranger than it can suppose. So this speaks to our tools to relate to reality. Whereas the reality tunnels of, the Blue Church tell us that, that we are individuals and we have our own wills and rights, and there's superstition and there's science and there's reality. Well, today, as Owen said, the stones are coming alive. That's all mixed. That's all mishmash. Superstition, the ghosts, the phantasm, the fantasies, they're all mixing together and coming alive in a way. We're being haunted through these black mirrors. Not only the black mirrors that maybe John Dee used to scry the Enochian language when he was working for Queen Elizabeth as Agent 007, but also the black mirrors that we carry in our pockets, spreading this schizophrenic mind AIDS, as I saw again on a meme.
Yeah, the black mirrors. Yeah, right.
It remembers me of Raoul Eschemann's performatism, which is an approach after postmodernity. Have you read about that?
Yes,
because this performative act to create beauty and truth, although we know that it can't be true, but to live with this duality in a way and do it anyhow, and to create something of value, and to change our perceptions and to change the world by that. And so that sounds like a pretty alchemic approach to that.
Precisely.
Yeah.
That's the idea of artistically mediated belief, right? And I think that it gets a little bit hard.
The only thing, I mean, I don't know performativism that well, but the slight gripe I have with it, although I agree with the basic idea behind it, is that the idea of performance itself is already slightly ironic. It's like when you perform, you are doing something other, you are pretending in a sense. And I think that
it's almost anti-Heideggerian or something, right? Heidegger was always talking about the German word, the authenticity. And that this constant disclosure towards authenticity, and if you just define life as a big performance and everything being fake.
Well, Andrew, but I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the great god of movie stars, Marlon Brando, he says like all life is acting, and in this sense.
Well, that's true as well. Yeah, I think.
That's again when it comes full circle, where, I just watched the movie Tenet, so forgive me for doing this gesture, but where past and future just come together and bind in this really weird way, because the question is there anything other than performance? Foucault said the same thing. All the postmoderns say the same thing, right? Is there anything outside of power? Is there anything that is not a power relationship? To name something, to say that something should be true and something should not be true, isn't that yet another recursive repetition of the same old story that is the story that we perform roles for each other, that we theorize stories within which we live, that we create these spiritual mind temples that we're supposed to inhabit? And the thing that I would bring up is that the theological ability, capacity, talents, resources to be able to create these, say, performances worth living is pretty fucking big and scary and hard. It's very pathic. It lies behind the barred absolute. It is not for those who want. It is not for the many. It is for the few. And I'm not really even sure that I'd like to sort of pierce that veil and put my head through that, right? Even Nietzsche said something like, for the lovers of the light, stay in the shadow, something like that. So the point being, it's very serious to create these time mind temples within which we might live, which is perhaps the task that we're collectively trying to address as we're looking past the time horizon of the fall of whatever postmodernism represents.
Yeah, that was well said. I think this kind of seriousness you're talking about often gets forgotten, when we speak about all these things, because they're so salient and, attractive, and, there's this bright light pulling us towards something. And
it's incredibly hard.
We have to become kind of, we have to be able to stand like, I'm just speaking a bit metaphorically here, if you'll forgive me, but we have to kind of stand in the middle of the chaos and not be torn to pieces, if that makes any sense.
That's precisely it.
Yeah.
I mean, like the idea that's come, or the image that's coming into my head about this performatism is like the distinction, say, between, let's say, like Guns N' Roses going up and performing as Guns N' Roses and Slash and Axl or Slash and Axl, versus some cover band going up and performing as like Guns 2 Roses and putting on a wig to look like the front man and to look like the lead guitarist. The second one are doing performance of performance. There's like a second order mimeticism there, whereas like in the former case, like Guns N' Roses are actually doing the real thing. They are just expressing themselves artistically. So they are performing, but they're doing it in a way that's like, that is the expression, where the second order performance is like performing as them. Does that make some sense?
Oh yeah.
Well, sure. I think the interesting thing about what you're saying, I mean, if you're Rolling Stones and you're singing for 40 years Satisfaction, I wouldn't ascribe there no more meaning than if some cover band would do it, because it's devoid of any meaning at that point.
Yeah,
that's very true.
So, but what I wanted to say, there are like different definitions of performatism, and I don't know, but it's on a tangent here, but there's this performatism you speak of. You perform as a band, made like a cover band, then you have like the postmodern notion of it, where you can like in the Butlerian way, where you perform a gender by announcing it, by a woman giving birth, like as a speech act. And then you have this postmodern notion of performatism, where you are engaging, say, with a artifact, with a piece of art, and you're creating some new worldview or some new experience or some new form of looking at the world and with the world in this Heideggerian sense. And so these are different notions of what performatism mean. And so it's, you know.
Well, but back to Guns N' Roses. I think that I think that the trick is, or the difficulty is that in the beginning you have this inspiration that comes kind of from a primordial place, and you take a risk and you put yourself out there, and then you become a caricature of yourself afterwards, right? You become you get further and further from that state of inspiration, which never, the end sof in the Jewish tradition means without end, right? Or this state of creativity without end. And I think the alchemical task is tapping into that state.
Yes.
Which is very hard when you're working with structures, right? Because you get attached to a structure, and that structure becomes reified, and you get some feedback and then the structure starts to take you over. So maybe the art of making a structure that works is finding a way to keep that that end soft, that spirit without end.
Let me riff on that. So performance, Irving Goffman, this Canadian guy, used to talk about performances as being this ubiquitous element of everyday life. When you go to a pharmacy to buy some medicine, it's normal that the people there sometimes are wearing like white robes, but why? They don't need to. They're not in the lab. It's a performative aspect. So do priests sometimes. It really has this charge of being a prop in a ritual, or the front, or a setting in this performance. Right? The Performances of Everyday Life, great book. And they actually have a function, which is a function to mediate the flows and perhaps let's call it this extended shared libidinal economy, the meaning economy of everyone, right? There's a reason why they wear a coat, because there's a charge of credibility to it, because there's a charge of hygiene, cleanliness, etc. But you pointed to something really cool, which was like talking about not so much the functional profane rituals and the performances, like, going to a pharmacy and getting some medicine and the guy being wearing a white robe, but the other perhaps more spiritual or more meaning dense performances. So the other day I went to a church here in Gdansk in Poland, and I was amazed at how throughout Europe, time and again, you find these amazing cathedrals, these huge buildings with such holiness, with such charge. And I was talking to my friend, and I was, I was sort of reinforcing that spiritual charge of the place, that beauty of the place. And he made a very good point, which is, but do you think everyone who went to church and goes to church actually understands the depth of the spirituality as you are trying to explain right now? Or did they just follow the ritual because everyone else did it and just followed the exoteric part of the doctrine without really understanding the esoteric part of the doctrine? And that's a great point. So you alluded to that, Andrew, which is, I would say the following. It is for the few to understand the esoteric, to be the channelers of the Ein Sof, down the dimensions, and to craft that into exoteric symbols that then, if they're well crafted enough, then perhaps you're actually building a holy work, building a temple, building a symbolic house where everyone else can live. Now, if there's no holiness at the core, then God has left the temple, he will not return, and all that's left is rot and ruins and the desert coming over and covering up the Sphinx.
Yeah, well spoken. Yeah, I agree.
Your
with
mention
all
of
that.
Your mention of the church brings up something which is a big difficulty in the design of societies, big and small, and indeed cultures and subcults and cults, which is that the strength of the organization is something like equivalent to the amount of authenticity that each of the top participants brings to it. And the larger it gets, the more it scales, the more people will end up showing up for just this like social decorum, for example, going to church because that's what you do when you go to church, or going to work because you get paid to go to work. And ostensibly, you know, you go to a job interview and they say, why do you want to work in this job? And you come up with some bullshit reason about how you've always wanted to be a chef or a teacher. But the truth is, it's like, well, in most cases, it's because I need to earn money. And now I need to say something good to make you think that I'm at least good enough at lying so that other people will believe that I want to be in this space. Whereas building the advantage of building a small sect or a secret society, and I believe this is the reason that secret societies have existed throughout to create a little closed container where the libidinal energy and attraction is such that everybody is devoting a lot of themselves to what might be achieved in that space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And well, it's true that the esoteric is always, governed by a certain kind of elitism, right? It's elitarian, if that's a word. It's not egalitarian, and it never can be. And that's just the way it is, because there's only a certain amount of people that want to step that close to the fire, right? So in a traditional society, people would understand that. You know, they would understand that you know you're cut out for that, or you're not. And so if you're not cut out for that, you do other things, and you have an ordinary life, and you know, within the realm. But there is a central core. There is this, as you expressed so well, Daniel. There is this kind of burning. There's this hearth and this fire that you are receiving the blessings from that. Just by being a good person or doing whatever you do. But the problem today is that everybody wants to kind of get into the esoteric, and nobody wants to do the preliminaries, the steps that are required to become there. So everybody thinks you have access to I don't know. Maybe I'm being conservative when I'm talking like that or something.
No,
but
I agree with you. I think you're being pragmatic. Let me throw something to that, which I wholly agree with what you said, right? Here's a thought. There's perhaps two ways to address or to reach this inner burning core, or rather to reach the core of the alchemical pursuit. One of them is through because of the law of equivalent exchange, right? There's no free lunch. You have to give something in return, and you can give a lot of time, a lot of effort. Time is the only wealth that doesn't scale, right? So you can give some of your time, some of your effort, study, discipline, self-control, etc., sacrificing something for others.
Kind of the
word. Yeah. And there's self-sacrifice, but there's also sacrificing the libido, which is stored in other institutions. That's why breaking rules is kinky and gives people like a sort of a sexual charge. I think that's why so many cultures throughout the ages have sacrificed living beings for the sake of their gods. Because that's when you kill the lamb, ritualistically speaking, perhaps inside the Holy of Holies and this core closed ritual behind the Barred Absolute, you're doing that same effort, which, I don't know if there needs to be sort of a sacrifice. That's my whole point. And that sacrifice can be of one of two types. That it's either self-sacrifice or hetero-sacrifice.
In the Vajrayana tradition, you give samadhi, intense concentration, right, of an object or something like that, and that's how you transform. That's how you offer your libidinous or your energy to the fire, so to speak, right? But in the more archaic religions, you would do this cheap thing where you would make the offering of somebody else, of the scapegoat, in order to pay that debt, right?
Yeah, and to tie it back to Tom and Parallax, we're living in a time of chaos. We're living in a time where the instinct to sacrifice something else that is out there for the sake of some personal gain is rampant, and it gets chaotic because you want to burn the collective accumulated capital of the sacrifices of a lot of people and a lot of things, and there's something to be gained out of that, perhaps more instantly, but it's the fire that burns very brightly but perhaps does not sustain itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, the fact that it doesn't sustain itself, I think it does sustain itself, but it doesn't need, it does. I mean, it's always already present in everything, but it's the human life that burns itself out somehow, or.
Mm-hmm. There's at least it burns itself until there's no longer anything to burn. Eliphas Levi, this occultist, mentioned in one of his books, like The History of Magic, I think, that, you know, at the time when the Jews were prisoners in Babylon, there were these Babylonian kings who were, I think, the Magi. And I'm just trying to relate the story. I'm probably butchering it, but the idea was that they knew, or someone that was warned, that Cyrus, quote unquote, the Great, was outside of the walls and was going to go in and was going to like pillage and ransack and conquer the city. But they chose to do nothing. I think it was the prophet Daniel who warned them. And they chose to do nothing, but they instead chose to throw this last orgy, to go out in a dying bang, an orgy that emitted a light so bright that even the skies looked like they were day when it was actually the night, something like that. And then they died. And with them, all their secrets. And this kind of happened again in the fall of Rome again, right? There's early stage civilizations, mid stage civilizations, there's late stage civilizations. Everything has kind of this life cycle, the word life being essential here. And I think that's what we're navigating through, honestly, at this point in history.
You orgy at the end.
Yeah.
Do you hear me? Do you hear me with my phone now?
Yeah.
All right. That was actually something that Douglas Murray said in the podcast yesterday. Let me come back to that, because he said, historically speaking, it's a sign of the end of a civilization if topics like identity politics and trans issues take first rank amongst other things, you know. And so that's like, you can see that when the Greek Empire fell and their emphasis on you know, gender topics at that time, and so that's quite interesting.
Yeah, I thought, well, just you know, everything splinters into little, you know, groups and factions and tribes, and
exactly, yes.
And then everybody's at each other's throat. It's the war of all against war. I mean, war of all against all. But I wonder why that, what gender has to do with that. That's my question.
I think it has to do with the technology has a role to play in this. I'm going to connect Mark Fisher and occultism. So he did it already, whatever. But like hauntology, this idea that we are haunted by the fantasies, or in French, phantasma, of surplus libido that finds no vessel to be held with it. And when that vessel is broken, vessels that are, for example, power apparatuses in society, institutions like marriage, or things like old gender roles, they were vessels. And vessels have the property to constrain and oppress, but they also hold something together. When you break that vessel, it's like the Pandora's box is open.
Exactly.
The Pandora's box is
the ghost just goes
wide open at the moment, right? Yeah.
If you can deconstruct the most basic, if you can deconstruct the most basic perceptions we have, like we are for men and not for like other identities, and disrupt that kind of perspective, then you can deconstruct basically everything.
Precisely.
But that is a demonic force in that sense, because it's a process of continual fragmentation and you know, and ripping apart people's most common sense axiomatic views of themselves, you know, ordinary people in the world being, you know, assaulted by subhuman messaging on some level, you know, that makes them doubt everything about themselves, and, you know, from their health to their sex to, you know, whatever, right?
Precisely.
Well, look, like contemporary capitalist society, Mark Fisher makes this point in Capitalist Realism, I think, it's just very essentially unsatisfying. Like never before has barred subjectivity in the Lacanian sense been more deeply felt by people. And so they're clinging for something that feels real, that feels legit, that feels authentic. And like gender is one of the oldest things we have. It predates capitalism, it predates feudalism, it predates tribalism, basically. And it's also worth pointing out that actually us guys here, we're also quite interested, like Andrew and I are both involved with the men's movement. Tom, I don't know quite how connected with you are as well, but Fraga, like Daniel, I've mentioned it to you a couple of times. It's like, there is also a positive project along these alignment of gendered lines. It's like, we're not standing here observing that the current point is devolving and just collapsing into people bickering about genders, but there is also something very real about that gender polarity that needs to be investigated and primed into. You know, we also see Andrew, you just spoke to Rachel Haywire and Raven Connolly, right? Who are like, they're doing this project, like the Philosopher Queens, which I find super interesting in main part just because there's a lot of male voices in this space doing philosophy work, and I'm intrigued to see what sort of femininity they might be able to uncover that goes beyond the identitarian feminism, not feminism, but female perspective.
Yeah, there's a few things to say about that. In a state of total fragmentation, you know, people just, you know, there's the war of all against all, and there's the, you know, the society falling apart. But then there's, you know, first mountains and rivers are mountains and rivers, then they're not, and then they have to become mountains and rivers again with a capital M and a capital R, right? They have to, so there has to be a new synthesis, right? I guess it's a Hegelian thing as well, right? Within that negativity, there has to be a new synthesis. So there has to be a new concretion, or you know, using this Hegelian language of something which would be, it would be both a return, and it would also be a path forward. And me and Alexander have been speaking of this as being the Exodus myth in a sense. And that's what the culture is missing, an Exodus myth, like a way out of this, you could say, identitarian, stomach eating itself, or brain eating itself, a zombie kind of apocalypse, or whatever you want to call it, is just like a landscape of total nihilism, and then so there is this need to rediscover the Exodus myth. And if you don't have that, and what I mean by the Exodus myth is just not necessarily there's a social level to that. There's an inner, outer, and a secret level to that. You know, there's the getting out of the paradigm, present paradigm, and then there's also, you know, liberating yourself in some kind of way, so you actually have a constructive view and have a forward vision, and have discovered a constructive meaning and mission in your life, which is, you know, we talk about as being the phallic, which is very counterintuitive to the discourse that's out there, which is all about sort of you know, healing our wounds.
I think
If I may, because that's something that I was thinking about all day. You know, I was partaking at some forum, metamodern forum, and so there was a question, you know, what is metamodernism? And you know, it was all, you know, about oscillating. I will fit this in our current conversations. Like, what is metamodernism? It's an oscillation between, you know, modernism and postmodernism, and you know, the paradigm is pretty similar to what Wilber was doing, the integrating what came before. But you know, my impulse, but my thinking is that, you know, additionally to the integration what came before, because all these previous movements, like feminist movements, they all have their purpose. But you know, if you talk about emergence, there's something new that is not necessarily it is the result of the past, but it's still something new. You know, you can't explain it solely by looking at the past. There's a new information which makes the thing interesting and intriguing. It's like a new piece of art, and you don't understand it, but it's a new paradigm, and you can't really explain metamodernism or integral just by looking at the past and integrating the previous stages of development. But there has to be a new quality, you know. And I feel that is what we're talking about. Like, what could it be? You know, like, is it phallic? Is it like a palpable a new vision for the future, you know,
Yeah.
some performative act. And so, and I feel like in those circles, this new aspect of emergence is kind of missing, because they're just looking at the past. You have to integrate modernism, the good parts, and then the good parts of postmodernism, but that's not sufficient. You know, it's there's missing something.
It doesn't
and that
take into account the novelty and also the Venus energy.
And the masculine. It's
and the masculine.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that.
I'm glad.
Go ahead, Owen.
I'm glad that we wound up here, because it's something I think about a lot, which is just like I have this kind of like intuitive dislike of the meta-modern framing, and that's like I appreciate the point and what it's trying to do and establish itself as a new era, but for one thing, it feels like it's just playing more games with prefixes. We're just going to throw a meta on it to show that we've gotten bigger. And for all of the thinkers who are considered postmodern didn't really name their project postmodernism. That was something that came after. But then there's also this sense that the idea of modernism, I believe, is about conquering territory. So the modern project kind of quite explicitly, you know, is expansionist, and they were going to use rationality and science to do these things. Then postmodernism was almost about conquering modernism itself by turning this very intellectual critique on its language games and pulling it apart. And now the metamoderns seem to think that if we can just recognize that, then we can conquer it all, and then we're going to be all right. And I think that's precisely the wrong point to look at. You know, Daniel, you said something to me that I felt very deeply the other day, which is like, in some deep sense, we have to accept that we've lost to techno capital. It's a beast that is fucking run and grown up from within us, and it's kind of taken us over. And so I was writing about this in the email thread earlier. It's like, there's this weird Hegelian inversion where just at the point where modern man thought he was going to take over the world with his machines, they've turned around and consumed him. And now we're all in the belly of this new digital goddess bitch beast. And we're like, what the fuck?
Yeah. Interesting, because we had a discussion today on about I was reading this guy's book Catalast, and his formula was, you know, modernism, postmodernism, and then transmodernism. And I jumped on that because I thought at least it has the transcendental aspect in it, where metamodernism seems like a lot of jacking off to me, like if I can be a little bit blunt, like whereas the transcendental, right, that's, you know, like Tom wrote a book about will and transcendence, and that has some meat to it to me. And then you were kind of, you objected a little bit because it seemed like, okay, here's another prefix or whatever, and it's just another game, and you know, that we can play. And I could see your point as well, but
the way that I see this is that there's two modes to look at it. One of them is that which Owen intuitively dislikes, and which I can understand why he says that, which is the being against term coining prematurely. And the other one, which is I think the juice of the matter, which we're all actually trying to get at, which is the hardest thing. So we try to look to the past and figure out our frame, is the actual phallic energy of the establishment, of the edifying, of the constructing, of the proper way to relate to the chaotic landscape within which we are engaged. You know, the accelerationists talk about exit. I have personally, like, you know, come.
I lost your voice. Is that just me, or?
I don't know if you.
I kept it, but maybe just rehash the point, Daniel.
Okay, so the point is that I want to get to the point that is domesticated, right? Pandora's box is open. We live in a chaotic world. All these memes, all these ghosts are haunting us from every side. So we were to creating these makeshift DIY names that we put onto reality to sort of help us navigate it. But I think that at this point in history, at the very moment when we finish perhaps naming the thing that we see and put it out there, that is already outdated.
It's already over,
because of speed, because of acceleration. Yeah, the game is over the moment that you put a name on. So obviously there's the other way, which is the, I would call it more of a phallic Deleuzian way of engaging with the flux of how things become. And that's why I come back to the applied science of domesticating ghosts, of the behaviorism of belief. So Nick Land and Guy Debord and so many of the people speak about intelligence having become autonomous as a process. So our ghosts, I keep coming back to the idea that in French fantasy or sexual fantasy is called phantasme. I don't know if I'm right on this, but I think they overlap in a way. And that's precise. Why? Because this surplus libido, right, that does not fit into the old vessels has run amok. Capitalism wants to make a buck out of that, so it really incentivizes that. And so it just runs amok to the point where all these ghosts, this army of the dead is currently in charge of things. We've lost that battle. And I think that within the cacophony of chaos, the right thing, or a worthwhile message that is more towards the trend that you were saying is necessary, Andrew, something edifying, something constructive, something more phallic, something that is more about like, okay, how do we do things? For me, is to say that the proper way to engage is to talk about how to domesticate, how to.
What do you mean by that phrase? You said domesticate ghosts, and my mind went blank, and I wasn't quite sure what you meant by that.
Yeah, so what I mean by that is that, our thoughts appear in our minds, not out of a void, right? There's a context, there's a mimetic context, there's a discursive context. I have a name, I use sentences that have a predicate and a subject. That's already like a thing in itself. Power, as Foucault said, is something that's embedded in everything, right? And what capitalism and postmodernism did is to basically throw that into chaos. And techno-capitalism is king in doing that. And obviously, let me see if I get this in a way that's not too confusing and contrived. The spectacle becomes autonomous. All of the ideas that we have are integrated into the belly of the large machine.
Oh, I see. Mm-hmm.
And they transcend us. They become too large. And in a sense, we are no longer an I, we are subservient to this machine. The ideas that we have are not our own. The tastes that we have are formed, governed by men that we have largely never heard of. This was said by Walter Lippmann in the 20s and the 30s. This was said by Bernays, who, by the way, is the nephew of Freud. So already there, he was intuiting this idea that psychoanalysis was already getting to at the time as well, which is these ghosts, these wills, these libidinal freaks are coming out of Pandora's box. They're coming out of the old vessels. The old vessels are no longer good enough, right? The isms of the past become outdated extremely fast, and the rate at which they become obsolete is accelerating. So that's why the art of building the new vessels, for me, is an art of domesticating desire, of designing desire itself. Because right now, person A is doing philosophy because they're psychically and sexually impotent. Person B is doing philosophy because they want to get chicks in bed. Person C is making philosophy because, maybe because they love truth, whatever. Motives and desires are so large, right? It's every marketing department knows this. They tap into this. They make a buck out of this. And I think that the creative thing to do to edify is really to construct. And this construction will not be universal because there's no universal mommy or daddy. This will not be distributed equally. This will not be, it's like settling a new landscape, really. It's settling the noosphere that's currently at war, the war of everyone against everyone. That's what Dugin calls nuomachia. And I think that from that landscape, there's going to be, things happening after this current.
What I like about what you're saying, and you mentioned John Dee, and you talk about phantasma and magic, and in our preliminary talk we even talked a little bit about Crowley. I have a friend who is like a professor in the university in Berlin, and he had an order of occult art, right? And so that was an order for literature, basically, but they used these old techniques to bring out new forms of description of phantasma. It was not just poetry. There was like a vivid, a living thing being invoked there, and this is like one of these great prerogatives of magic. Still, I think that it can do that. That it still offers the tools and the techniques to, crack open the models of the world that we have, and be confronted by the chaos and to create something new in there.
Yeah, I've been studying this form of Hermetic Kabbalah recently, and the methodology is interesting because you have these cards and you you stare at an image, and it's usually an alchemical image, of mercury and sulfur, and symbolized by the sun and the moon. And actually the sun is feminine and the moon is masculine in that, which is, I thought, kind of interesting. And anyway, you look at this card, which is a sort of primordial design, and you stare at it and you allow your mind you can use your intellect and associative mind to go deeper into this image, and you study it for several days, like 9 days. The first part of the meditation is you study this image. The second part of the meditation is you visualize the image, and you try to keep the image, just the pure visualization of the image in silence, and you deepen just the perceptual part of the image, so it becomes more embodied. Right? That's the second stage of the practice. And the third stage of the practice is you dissolve everything. And usually there's sort of a bliss that arises, and there's a kind of pure creative spirit, right? That comes, which can be anything. It's sort of in this dissolving stage. And so I thought that model was very, very interesting in terms of, how we can look at alchemy and magic, because there was nothing particularly like I don't know, freaky about it. It was all very straightforward on one level at the same time, right? All very.
I'd say we've been made familiar to this sort of way to relate to memes and symbols, because now they saturate and permeate every aspect of our lives. In other words, the reason why pentagrams and little Horus eyes don't really work anymore today in their magical, accursed character, at least in the way that we fantasize that they used to in the past, is because they've become deflated. There's so many other symbols around them that by sheer virtue of scale, they just don't have the same impact in our already calloused perception. Let me just read something to you that the mad prophet Nick Land, who's for me nothing but an occultist talking about technology, said, "What is concealed, the occult, is an alien order of time which betrays itself through coincidences, synchronicities, and similar indications of an intelligent arrangement of fate." I think this connects to the Kabbalah deeply. An example is the Kabbalistic pattern occulted in ordinary languages, a pattern that cannot emerge without eroding itself, since the generalized human understanding and deliberated usage of letter clusters as numerical units would shut down the channel of coincidence. I know this sounds a little bit weird, but hear me out. Coincidence, also known as alien information. So it's only because people use words without numerizing them that they remain open as conduits for something else. To dissolve the screen that hides such things, and by hiding them enables them to continue, is to fuse with the source of the signal and liquidate the world. Now, for me, this is a little bit referring to that process that you were talking to about, Andrew, of figuring out a relationship to the symbol, what is hidden, what is true. And this is kind of a schizoanalytical or a very creative pursuit as well, of trying to figure out where ideas come from, how do we relate to them, how do they relate?
And the symbols have to be rediscovered and renewed in a view that is I don't know how to say that, with the correct view, rather than as some kind of parlor game or
Yes.
there has to be some kind of study behind, what is the ground of all of these symbols that bubble up from, and rather than them becoming some kind of reified, formulaic kind of, like very, very easily, we have this potential to create all these cults, right? We have this these days, which is a bit terrifying. So.
Yeah, I think there's a relationship between that and that practice that we're just talking about, and then the danger that is hidden within it, the madness of actually reinventing the whole root of reality for yourself. It's a serious game. It's a game. That's where master morality comes from confronting this abyss and coming back to tell the story to everyone else. So there's the few that are brave enough to risk stepping out of this mimetic house within which we live, and there's those who follow those who do. That's for me, that's the barred absolute. That's master morality itself.
Owen, how do you have specific practices to go down the abyss and rejuvenate the ideas and memes and narratives?
I would say not really. I mean, what I try to do, I'm trying to give myself a real, like, strong grounding in yoga and yoga meditation at the moment, almost as a preliminary to anything else. And that does at points involve, I mean, like, where this overlaps with, say, what Andrew was talking about with that Kabbalah exercise, you know, and I'm sure, like, Andrew perhaps gets a sense of this as well from his meditation practices. Is like meditating, say, on an object or a mantra, where there's the stages where it's like you bring the object into awareness, and then there's like merging with the object, and then there's just like feeling energetically the same as the object. You know, as you were saying, it's that source from which the symbol arises. You yourself come directly into contact with. The symbol is almost just like the way that this energy is trying to communicate itself. But no, I don't actually have any of these like techno-shamanic practices on lock. Of, say, Chris Gabriel, super fucking interesting. This like prodigy kid, he's 20 years old. He's got this YouTube channel called Meme Analysis. They're putting out videos that are regularly getting hundreds of thousands of views, because I mean, he's read so much fucking psychoanalysis, and he's taking a contemporary psychoanalytic lens to the depths of 4chan and Reddit, and looking at these memes, the forever alone, the doomer, the boomer, the gloomer, and saying, right, what does this say about the contemporary psyche? And what does it say that so many people are being drawn to these memes? I think the great case study, which Daniel can probably narrate better than me, is the Keck meme, right? That came up around the time of Donald Trump. Daniel, would you be able to tell that?
It was hyperstition per se. Hyperstition is a superstition that...
Hyperstition, oh, that's a word. Wow.
Yeah, it's from the clan. It's the idea that you say something, and by saying it and infusing it with belief, it has an effect on reality and it becomes true. It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy that's actively put into display. And so the Keck thing was, on 4chan, it functions kind of like an Ouija board or a scrying mirror, insofar as every post has an associated number. So it's like every post that you make has a number to it. And then when all those, 7-digit number, and whenever those numbers are notable, when there's like repeated digits, like on 2s and 3s and 4s, people like pay attention and sort of follow that more other than the other ones, because, oh, it's a double, it's a triple, fun. Okay, let's repeat this ad infinitum. So there was a meme that once was about Pepe the frog, and it said something like Trump will win, and the post was like 7777777, and so people started to really just reinforce this belief tunnel, which was very luck based, but also very meme based, obviously. But within that small field that was the 4chan and window and the internet landscape, which is just within this black mirror, it gained so much momentum, also in connection with how people were making sense of things, that people started to find coincidences everywhere. So apparently there was an ancient Egyptian god that was the god of chaos that was also in the shape of a frog, and the hieroglyph that represented that frog looked like a dude on a computer. And people started to discover, old Italo disco songs from the 60s that had a frog with P-E-P-E under it. And the whole thing was about magic and creating alternate holes in fabric of space-time. So all of these coincidences, they kept coming in at a rate that was just reinforcing this mimetic, this egregore.
Sounds like a schizophrenic state in some sense, right?
That's precisely what it is. It's schizoanalytical, which is another way, a Deleuzian way to say it's magical or ceremonial.
But then what happened is Trump ended up retweeting the pictures of this frog, right? And then I think even did Hillary Clinton not also say something about Pepe's, at which point the chants went absolutely mad, because they were like, oh my God, it's true. Like, we've been rambling about all of this, and now they are actually talking about it. And so it's like this bizarre thing where this schizophrenic conspiracy theory has been so charged with collective libido that it becomes
real. I see. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that's, I guess, the lessons that so many government contractors and mimetic warfare agencies, they took lessons from that. And now we see things like QAnon pop up, and we see all of these, let's say, artificial information campaigns going around, which are, for me, reiterations of this lesson. Like, oh, belief is malleable. Oh, we can use memes for this. then let's do it. And let's do it as best as we can using all this knowledge. And that's what the alchemists knew. And that's kind of a dark way to be a sorcerer nowadays. That's, using alchemy for quick gains here and there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Dark magic, basically. I mean,
The manipulation of belief for purposes. Something that, Madison Avenue had a...
You mentioned QAnon?
Yes.
What does that have to do with that?
Because I think it also preys upon some of the lessons that existed on Pepe, namely coincidence, namely this technique of predicting things, saying this will happen and then it happens and it validates, namely, speaking along magical terms or psychologically charged terms, being a meme in itself, right? Being something that's spread around memes, perhaps for a different target audience, not so much the young dudes of 4chan, but Trump's base overall. But I think it's just the same sort of activity of I wouldn't be surprised if you found creative directors from agencies working in this stuff, because it's just the natural consequence, the natural career transition. If you see that Blue Church advertising is going down the pipes in a few years, and I know this is controversial, but there's something to it. And I think that this is
coming back to performatism. Is it something that you can create? Is it that kind of performativism, or is it something that is in a way a living thing that you can't really control?
I think it's a bit of both. So look at the best music or the best art. It's always a mad artist, right? Something on the verge of schizophrenia, someone who has an intimate knowledge of something else, and that the madder the artist, the better the art. Not necessarily, but there's a relationship there, right? There's also the other way around, which is laboratory music, fabricated music. It's why Justin Bieber has zero longevity, or pop music has zero longevity, but Goethe and Faust lasts forever, and the Bible lasts forever. So I think that we're talking about the same thing, but on different ends of the same spectrum. So yes, this could be created. QAnon could be created perhaps in a laboratory, in a mimetic laboratory with creative people. But I think that there's a dimension where you actually have to have some real pathos.
It's a cheap kind of magic, though, isn't it? It's like we were talking about a sacrifice earlier. It's like sacrificing a lamb to get what you want or something. It's like, it's probably very appealing to some people to go that route.
It's mind McDonald's.
And how do you fight it? How do you memes that destroy memes or something like that? For me, the alchemical process might be like you would create a meme that would destroy this tendency of driving people insane. Or unless you're an accelerationist, I guess that Nick Land is. He wants the world to break open into this schizophrenic state so that a new synthesis will come, or I don't know.
I think what you're driving at, Andrew, is this need to inoculate ourselves across whatever this like schizophrenic technosocial phenomenon is. And I think the fact that we exist within this media landscape where we're being bombarded by images and sound bites and potentially memes that we don't even understand, but that are so libidinally charged from the depths of wherever anyway, there's a real, the alchemical practice is to just notice that, that's fucking going on. And then discover the practices, or at least the spaces where one can unplug from that and say okay, if that is the dynamic of where we're at, how can we channel it towards something transcendent as opposed to getting wrapped into the lowest common denominator?
Mm-hmm. Well said. Yeah.
And this is where do you guys...
Tom?
Sorry, Tom, go on.
I wanted to ask one thing, because if you talk about these how do you say this charged symbols, like in prehistoric or ancient times, it was legitimized through a priest or a shaman or a true alchemist, right? So but what you're talking about, this Pepe, that is like there
a bunch of 20-year-olds, basically. It's a bunch of
but there's no true legitimization except that it's chance, right?
Yes.
Because you said it. So there's no true alchemist fabricating those things, because in that case you mentioned, it was just chance. It was like a coincidence.
Chaos magic.
Then it got. Do I get
I
that
would say
right?
the internet itself is the priest that is blessing it. You know, it's the 4chan board that put the 77777.
Right.
Yeah, it's
Pure
chaos magic.
coincidence, but on some shared space. It's like if we were in a tribe and there was an agreed holy river, and all of a sudden a ram's head showed up severed in the holy river. We'd be like, holy fuck, that's not good.
That's precisely
Right.
why some people talk about the digital flood or the epistemic Armageddon. Because Tom, whereas before we had priests, and in the Blue Church era, the 20th century, we used to have some academics actually being the validators of what's true or not. You know, they would look perhaps at the Pepe phenomenon and would say, "Oh, that's just coincidence," and I'd throw some psychoanalysis, throw some politics and sociology that is according to the truth regime, and you know, it's all settled, tightly packed. You can put it on CNN, but what it shows is is the fact that perhaps there's no one actually driving today. There's no
Actually, it shows that children are driving the whole thing. You know,
It's
babies,
decentralized, I
right?
guess.
Babies are running the show. Like I was watching, this, you know, what's the social dilemma thing on Netflix, right? And all those guys, those IT guys, they're brilliant Asperger kids who have really super high IQs and no wisdom, right? So no wonder they created a monster. They have no wisdom, and they have no there's no authority. There's no shaman, you know, who is taking them through the steps towards wisdom. So they're just completely making it up as they go along. And so and again, then we have these figures like Greta, I think that it's basically like a child's crusade or something.
Let me refine on that and why I don't necessarily agree with you. So I think it's a property of two things. One of them is the system. So now the system is decentralized, whereas before the institution was pyramidal, and there's someone at the top who has the power to say this is how it's going to be, period, right? And you know, the academia and the schools back in the day, there was like a clear chain of command of truth. This is where truth will flow down the Kabbalistic tree of life or the societal pyramid, and that's it. There's no other opportunity. Whereas today, the properties of the system, of the internet, of techno-capitalism, the internet as technology, decentralized meaning making, and then capitalism creating an incentive, being the market for the proliferation. So the system has those properties in itself, which is even more dangerous than having the children run it. So that's one thing, right? That's the system argument. It's of the system.
So it's not the children, it's the algorithms that are running it. Is that sort of like what you're saying, or?
It's the system being kind of the vessel for unchained desire being rampant. This is the spectacle by Guy Debord. This is the autonomous collective intelligence of techno-capitalism, according to Nick Land, which is collective human libido being unchained from any other vessel, becoming autonomous.
I think, Andrew, you're right to say children. That is precisely the point. It's the childish libido that is unconstrained, that is not learned to channel itself towards something higher.
Yeah,
It's this weird confluence between
the youth culture, hero, worship that Alexander always talks about. The rock star, the movie star, all these people being the ultimate symbol of something, but what? It's sort of an empty kind of thing.
There's no throne in the system.
And it's self-terminating, and it doesn't lead to wisdom and transcendence and real beauty and all those things, right?
Well, I think,
what do you think of Jordan Peterson then? Because he still rests on this pyramidal structure of society. He is like a professor, and he charged the symbols in a new way, and he created memes. So it's like the antithesis of what you just said.
Well, yeah, that's what I was sort of. That's what we need. That kind of thing. Even if he was off in certain ways, but I think that's exactly the kind of thing that we need. Yeah, is the Jordan Peterson types. There was a problem with how popular.
I don't know if we need it, but it's clearly a different way of what Daniel is describing, because it's not. Okay. Then I didn't get you. Okay.
So no. I mean, it's a great point to bring up, but he became big on the internet. He is a psychologist that talks about the Bible and Christianity. So already here, this cross-domain situation, he has no expertise. He only has perhaps expertise on according to Blue Church, in psychology. But having become big on the internet, talking about Christianity, becoming this leader for this male sort of more male movement, is for me a symptom of these dynamics that I described. So it was a very decentralized internet age phenomena that he had it.
All right.
And perhaps by tapping into this variety of things that he did, he put a head to a lot of desire that was already out there of people looking for meaning and looking for a way out, an exit for the current.
Yeah, I think he kind of became the archetype that was missing in the culture, and that also destroyed him in a sense. That it's too much for one person to bear. It's like that has to be distributed, right, on some levels. And his view of sort of the sovereign individual, kind of conquering and pulling himself up by the bootstraps, and is great. But it's sort of like the first part of the story. It needs to be completed by a vision that, you know, where this responsibility is distributed, I think, right? Does that make any sense what I'm saying? Like, it has to be a community that does that makes that kind of change, and it can't be one sort of savior who is, because then he develops a kind of a Christ complex, and then, you know, of course he gets crucified.
Absolutely. Like, I think if he had developed a community around him and grown it slowly, it might have been a very different story. But in a sense, he tapped into this very primal, symbolic charge and then distributed it entirely in a way that led people to just be like, this is the daddy I never had. He's the savior, as you said, Andrew. He just became this Christ figure. You know, you look at the YouTube videos and there's something like quite eerily, like, it was like he's the second coming of Christ almost, like Peterson's come to save us. I mean, intriguingly as well, just based by what we've been saying already, he also has a voice that sounds a bit like a frog, and for a while that went round on the chans.
Sure.
That I think he took a photo with Kermit the Frog, kind of unknowing about this whole Ket conspiracy, but that exploded something off as well. There was something else I wanted to say about him. No, it's gone from my mind.
Yeah, but I agree with you, Owen. You're on point.
He got drawn into the political game, right? He got drawn into the old battle of left versus right, 20th century.
West versus East, you know, or, you know, whatever. Like, there was a what's the word? A Manichaean good or evil sense of mission that he had, which was powerful in a sense. But, you know, I don't know, that the Taoists say that charisma has a kind of sickness or something. I kind of felt that about his charisma in some kind of way, in retrospect. Although I think he was genuinely very heroic and brave in what he did, and he genuinely lifted a lot of people up. And so I don't want to sound like I'm you know, cutting him down.
You know what's coming to mind?
Yeah,
Owen, you remember when we talked to Mac once, and he said that any critique of a contemporary sort of left SJW situation is recuperated as white supremacy. And recuperation is a term that comes from situationist theory, which is the idea that, you know, Che Guevara, you know, the revolutionary, even revolutionary causes like the one of Che Guevara eventually gets recuperated into capitalism, even if it's by selling T-shirts that say Che Guevara, right? Every sort of the 60s became yoga moms in 2020. So perhaps Jordan Peterson also got recuperated by the machine, by being brought into this field of, you know, capitalism versus communism, which is for me just a distraction from the essential, perhaps pathic nature of what he was actually tapping into. I mean, when he was making a million videos on YouTube about the Bible, it being hyperlinked, and making videos about Christianity that had 1 million views, I think that's where we're talking about the true energy coming in. But that obviously gets recuperated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like when you become famous, there are two versions of you You have the reductive version of you, which becomes kind of an avatar for a certain ideology. And then your substance gets lost in the noise, and a certain amount of people are aware of your substance, but most people just get your avatar, your ideological, because his critique was against ideology, and then he became a sort of ideologue himself. Like there was something about that.
But isn't that also, Andrew, Greek tragedy, that the traits that lifts us up are exactly the same traits that bring us down?
Exactly. Yeah. There's something very tragic about it. It's almost like unspeakable or something. I get the sense like he died, or like he just disappeared, and then it's almost hard to speak about him now because what happened? It's like some person who's still out there is like a ghost, and you talked about haunting. So there's this. We're living in this time where Jordan Peterson is sort of haunting us in some kind of a way, because he's not actually out there doing his thing anymore, but he's kind of haunting the landscape. He's kind of like a ghost.
Yeah, exactly. No, because we all at some point will fall out of time. When the personality traits and that what we learned just doesn't fit the environment anymore, and then we become ghosts and not active actors anymore. That's a terrifying thought, actually.
But perhaps that's why Alexander talks about the death of celebrity culture coming in the next 10 years, and also why there's something to be said perhaps of the admission that we've already lost, that agency is an Enlightenment age relic alongside with the individual as a category of a being, right? The individual that does things in the world. I mean, who are we? Napoleon? No, we're not. We're just people in our time doing our things. And perhaps, Andrew, to what you said, talking about communities, maybe it's going to be about the network effects of algorithms. Maybe it's going to be about the ideas being the protagonists, not us, the ideas.
I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah. I like very much the idea that here, as we're speaking, we're creating an idea, that might have some kind of momentum, creative momentum.
I mean, I think you already can sense this. It's like it was actually quite funny. I got a WhatsApp message. It was yesterday, and there was some guy I don't really know him. He got my number, and he texted me like for 3 minutes that in regard of Alexander Barth, and that the world is too masculine anyhow, and that I should go down the path rebel wisdom. But it's like, we're still in this battle of ideas, and it's a culture war, and which ideas will, and which memes, so to speak, will prevail in that sequence of the dance we are dancing eternally. It's just like, it's so weird. It was not it is not about Alexander or rebel wisdom or just like these ever recurring ideas that are haunting us. We are the ideas have us, and not the other way around.
When I started talking to John, John Vervaeke, I started to understand what he was saying about dialogos. He has this idea about dialogos being a genuine spiritual practice, where you kind of, if you're creating something like, me and Tom get together and we start to create something, and then the four of us kind of get together, and maybe another element, is created through dialogue, right? So there's this extra element that comes through dialogos, right? Dialoguing with truth. And that seems to be very, very beautiful, and that isn't an individual thing. That's not a lonely, romantic, heroic journey. It's more like being the Beatles or something than being being a solo artist.
Andrew, let me ask you to expand on something, because we're just talking about Peterson, and obviously around Peterson emerged this intellectual dark web movement, and then you wrote your piece, The Intellectual Deep Web, which is this kind of, I don't know exactly what to describe it, its own kind of movement that we are part of in some sense. What is the intellectual deep web as opposed to the intellectual dark web?
Well, that was, I think Alexander Biener was the guy who had that idea, and then I wrote the article for Rebel Wisdom because I was very dissatisfied with this movement. Actually, I was interested in Peterson and his biblical ideas, and I was following him, but I wasn't a big believer in the intellectual deep web because it seemed like a return to modernism, and which I thought was a positive movement in some sense because bringing back rationality and that kind of thing, and a sort of, it was a positive movement, but it didn't, to me, it didn't go deep enough. It didn't go far enough. It didn't have really something to say, which turned me on some level. So the idea that a deep web would be, an exploration of, deeper issues of anthropology and religion and, continental philosophy, not just positivism and science, and the whole sort of just a deeper view that wasn't, I guess, not on a stage trying to be a savior of some kind, but more like based on genuine relationships and friendships, and yes, there's a performative aspect, but it kind of happens. I think there's an edge to it as well because it's not slick, it's not packaged, it's not only, there might be a political aspect to it, but that's only a very small part of it. There might be an ideological aspect, but that's not the whole story. Yeah.
Feels like it's a practice. Like is the dialogue, is a space for dialogues to happen.
Right. It's a living process. It's process. It's always in process. It never stops anywhere. It's end soft. It's my favorite new word. End soft. It never ends. It never ends. And or end soft means light that never ends. And even but you make a representation of a black sun because in space the light has nothing to reflect on it. Right. So the lunar aspect is the Mercury, and that reflects wisdom, but it's actually this endless source, right? Yes. And it never reifies, it never stops, it never becomes something, permanent or final, or so there's always an open-endedness, a quality of open-endedness to the whole, endeavor.
I love this Kabbalistic.
But it seems like all of the intellectual dark web things.
I'm not Jewish either, but I love Ensof. Thank you. Sorry.
The dark web figures.
Owen.
I would say, so the dark web figures, they all in some sense or another, I think, had quite a serious link to some kind of political activism or some kind of political controversy, and wound up being perhaps the last breath of celebrity culture. The Weinstein brothers, Peterson, Ben Shapiro, Joe Rogan, they're all these like monolithic internet superstars who have humongous followings. Whereas what I think is going off in this dialogic deep web praxis, it's far more underground, and it's far more about the networks. And yes, like one or two people within it, like Alexander, are celebrities, but even Alexander has kind of backed away from his celebrity status a bit, as far as I can tell. And
or he's been pushed out of it because it's not a landscape that's livable in that environment of wokeness. You can't live there. There's no life there. It's like you have to go underground
to maintain a semblance of truth in Malkuth. You have to expend a tremendous amount of energy, and if the link to Ein Sof is severed, then it's just going to go down. And that linkage to Ein Sof through Yesod, reflecting, is the key. And Yesod, imagination, is inspiration, is the life force that comes. It's something that is common to so many good artists, to the genuine creators, but it's also extremely dangerous because, if there's not already any temple in Yesod that can protect you, then you're gonna go out in the rain, and it's too much. It's not for us because we live in Malkuth, right?